Can you hear me? All right. Thank you so much, Majid, and welcome to my talk about the future of mobile accessibility. First, just a couple of words about me. That is me. If you were here last year, you might remember me better as the guy behind that baby. At least it appears like everyone remembers just a baby. I'm a front-end developer for a consultancy company called Haugstvedt. I'm also co-organizer for the Oslo Accessibility User Group. We do meetups around once a month or every second month, starting up this year. And at the moment, as a consultant, I work for Telia, along with Majid and a few others in the audience, working on the web shop for Telia. So, since you're here, I guess you're interested in accessibility. Hopefully you attended Svetlana's talk yesterday. If not, I recommend watching it later when a video comes out. It was really good. Her talk was called Mobile Accessibility Past, Present and Future, so I was kind of worried we had a lot of overlap. Luckily, when she arrived here, I found out we kind of arrived. We arrived at the future and then went completely separate ways. So I'm taking off from this slide in her talk. Just a few words first about accessibility and the web content accessibility guidelines, as they are the basis of this talk. In 2007, we got the first iPhone. Before that, we didn't really care about internet on mobile. A year later, or almost 2 years later, we got the second version of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. At that moment, mobile was kind of immature, but it was taking off. I would have expected that they couldn't foresee everything that we have today, but those guidelines have proven pretty futuristic. They've kept up and kept pace with technology. However, some modifications were needed, which we'll arrive to in a few moments. In 2014, Norway, or in 2013, Norway introduced a law requiring accessibility, which went into effect in July 2014. At that moment, all companies, government organizations, teams, and so on had to follow the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And then, final item here is June this year, a new version arrived of the guidelines, the 2.1 version. It's not the rewrite. Everything from the second version is still there. It's the same, and you still have to follow that. 2.1 introduced new guidelines. These are all of them. There are 17 of them after some disappeared through the final stages of the recommendation completion. We're not going into all of them today. I've done another talk on that, so you can find it online. But we're focusing on some of the most important ones on mobile. That's not to say the other ones aren't affecting mobile, but these are ones we'll look into. So we'll start with the more design requirements. There are 4 ones I'm going to look into here. The first one is orientation. So basically, it's required that you should be able to use the website or app both in portrait and horizontal mode. Seems simple enough, but if you haven't cared about responsive design, if you kind of listen to what kind of device the user is on, you might send them a prepared website and so on. Should be outdated ways of doing stuff, but you still find that everywhere. So that's now a requirement. Text spacing, I'm just jumping a few because I'm going into detail on the other ones. Text spacing is basically that the user should be able to configure the spacing between words, letters, paragraphs, and so on. That helps, for example, users with dyslexia to better understand the content, to better consume it. So there's actually there's 4 numbers for how large spacing between those elements you should allow, and the website should still work. You shouldn't have content that are hidden outside of the screen or behind other content and so on. Right. So you see those 2 images on the right there. Those are of 2 Norwegian newspapers, VG and Dagbladet. They have had different ways of doing design. VG has basically just a fixed width of the page. If you're on a laptop with a small screen, you're not even gonna see all of that on normal resolution. And in the new guidelines, you're supposed to be allowed to zoom in 400% and not have to scroll in horizontal direction. Or basically, you should only have to scroll in one direction. That wouldn't work on Vega. Dagbladet, however, has gone with responsive design. So in their case, if the website is, or if the screen is too small to show all the content, it just wraps underneath and stacks up. Most of you probably know that technique, but maybe someone at VG should learn about it. All right. Yeah, that was it. Also, the last guideline there, target size. That's a guideline that had a lot of argument around it. There were 2 different levels of that guideline. Only one made it into the spec at the end. Basically, it says that every clickable area, for example, a button, a link, and so on, should be 45 by 45 pixels. Simple enough, and a lot of people doing, for example, mobile design have followed that rule for a lot of years. The argument went that this is difficult in some cases, for example, links within body text. So the final requirement has exceptions for certain cases, whereas originally there was a stricter requirement, that was a AAA level that required this for every clickable area. Right. So let's move on to a bit more interesting topics. So we have 3 requirements there, called, label and name, concurrent input mechanisms, and motion actuation. I'll start with the last one. It basically says that if the user has to move the device or do some kind of physical motion to do stuff, there should also be an alternative way. There are some users that can't do every type of motion. Maybe problems with the hands. The device might not support moving. So this just says you have to have an alternative way, which is kind of repeated in the guidelines for navigation and so on. You should also always have different alternatives to support different users. And you shouldn't assume how the user uses your device. Some people, if they can find out that the user is on mobile, they make certain assumptions about how the user will use that website, for example. And they will assume that you use touch. But some users use a keyboard connected to the phone, a physical keyboard. That might be because they have trouble using touch, because of finger dexterity, for example. It might be that it's just easier. They do productive work on the mobile and therefore prefer a physical keyboard. But in general, we just shouldn't make those assumptions. If you support keyboard on desktop, why wouldn't that still work on mobile? And of course, don't forget about the mouse. People still use it. And the final guideline was label and name. And that's one that makes me kind of curious, because that enables a lot of cool technology. In short, screen reader, for example, will connect to the accessibility tree in the operative system. That tree will expose the content that is shown on screen. Text will, of course, be communicated, but also images. You communicate the alternative text, for example. For buttons and links, it will communicate the text within the link or the button. But if you include an image or an icon inside of a button, the alternative text in that icon will be part of the accessible name for that element. And that is where we have certain problems. Because if that name appears before the text, that is what, for example, voice control will meet first, and that's what they will use. An example of voice control is Dragon Naturally Speaking. So you can, if you use that, you can, for example, say click continue or open menu. In those cases, continue and menu should be the accessible names. But if you have, for example, an arrow before the continue, the accessible name may be something like arrow continue. And Dragon wouldn't find, it wouldn't understand which button to click. So the requirement says that the visible text should always be in the label, and it should be first in the label. So you should rather, for example, use CSS to just move the icon to the left if that's what you prefer, but it should be placed after the text in the HTML. All right. Then we'll go to purpose of elements. There's two requirements. They're pretty tightly connected. The first one will influence input fields, and the second one will influence other kind of elements on the screen, like icons, links, and so on. We'll go into the first one first. So, identify input purpose basically says that you have to use, on the web, you have to use the autocomplete field to specify what kind of information do you expect in this input field. In these cases, you have a first name, you have a last name, you have a social security number, you have an email, and you have a mobile phone number. In the old days, we marked that up as a text input, maybe a number input, maybe a text input, maybe use the email type, and then you use the tell type. Now we have to specify even more what kind of content this is. So I'll have a code example here. If you can see on the input fields to the right here, I use the autocomplete attribute. This reacts, so it's camel case, but normally it's all lowercase. So you can see I have added the autocomplete name of given name, additional name, family name, street address, and so on. And you can also, for example, if you buy stuff, you can add that this content is for the buyer, or it's for the receiver. For example, if you're a company or if you buy a gift to someone else. So that when you use autocomplete in a browser, it will understand to a much higher degree than what's possible today which content to fill in. So this will help a lot of users who have trouble filling out forms, have trouble concentrating. It takes a lot of time for them. But of course, in addition to the standard and what that recommends, I also want to mention the new web payment API that, or the payment request API that is under consideration. It's now a candidate recommendation, and that will allow you to do the payment through a browser API. So the user can have pre-filled information on both address, payment info, and so on. And the user will have filled out which payment options they have, and you just support to that API which you support, and the browser will handle it. It will send that. It will collect the information that you specify that you require. The user will get a native payment box on the screen that they will recognize from site to site. So it will enhance user confidence in your site. It will enhance security because you have to give a lot less information to the different sites. Yeah, and of course it will help in the same way as autocomplete. Oh yeah, I forgot the arrow. And in addition to marking up the fields in what kind of input you want to support autocomplete, that can also help users customize. So you can add, for example, an icon. So that if the user doesn't understand, okay, email is pretty understandable, but in some cases they don't understand which content you're requesting. They may have trouble reading language and so on. So the user can have, for example, an extension in the browser that will trigger icons to be loaded next to elements, so they quickly understand that. All right. Another thing you can do with these requirements is specifying the importance of different content. So HTML5 is part of that. That will enable the users to hide content or highlight content that they want. So you can, for example, highlight important content, or you can just hide away different content. So you're more able to concentrate on the important task. Right. I'm about done now. One requirement that didn't make it to the standard is accessible authentication, which says that you should be able to log in without remembering information, for example, a password. An example of how people do that is Slack. They have the magic link. So you can just say, send me an email with a link, open that, and then you're logged in. Another example is forgotten password, which a lot of users use instead of passwords. Every time they log in, they just say, I forgot my password. They get sent an email to reset it, and then they're logged in. Works like a charm, but it should be simpler. All right, fine. I'm done. We covered that WCAG 2.1 loves mobile. It enables kind of mainstream technologies like voice control and a lot of stuff that people start using now. But that technology also supports accessibility. So that's all I had. If you have questions, just come up to me afterwards and I'll answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much.